When we think of Rome, the first things that come to mind are powerful legions, disciplined soldiers, and victories won time and time again. We tend to think that such a vast empire was built on courage alone. But was it really? Just stop and think about it for a moment. You have to feed thousands of soldiers. You have to pay them. You have to equip them with weapons. You have to build roads. You have to feed the horses. You have to build siege weapons. All of these things have one thing in common. They all require money. And that's why the real question is this: how did Rome finance these wars that lasted for centuries? And more importantly, what does any of this have to do with our lives today? Because when you take a closer look at Rome's economic system, a very interesting picture begins to emerge. War wasn't just something that happened on the battlefield. It was also at the very center of the economy. And once the system started working this way, there was no easy way back. Every new conquest meant new income. In a way, expansion stopped being a choice and became a necessity. Sound familiar? Now let's go back to the beginning. In the early years of the Republic, Rome didn't have an extraordinary professional army. Farmers who owned land would pick up their weapons when needed, go off to war, and return home once the campaign was over. But as Rome expanded, things began to change. Wars lasted longer. Battlefields moved farther away. A campaign was no longer something that ended in just a few months. The old system simply stopped working. The state began creating a professional army. And a professional army meant regular salaries. This was the moment when the cost of war reached an entirely different level. Rome was no longer just raising soldiers. It had to finance them. Then another major change took place. Every newly conquered territory became more than just a military victory. It also became a new source of income. Taxes, mines, trade routes, slaves, and tribute. War began paying for the next war. But even that had its limits. Rome didn't rely on taxes alone. Whenever necessary, it borrowed money as well. During long and expensive wars, the state raised funds from wealthy families and the powerful financial circles of the time. These people weren't doing it for free. They expected interest. They expected the right to collect taxes. They expected commercial privileges in newly conquered territories. In other words, for some people, war had become a profitable business. Over time, this also changed Roman politics. Successful generals gained more power. Wealthy families increased their economic influence. Responsibilities such as tax collection and military logistics were handed over to private individuals and groups. In a way, war became not only a function of the state but also a major economic industry. But maintaining this system became increasingly expensive. Soldiers had to be paid. Debts had to be repaid. New sources of income had to be found. And when conquest slowed down, things became even more difficult. One of the methods Rome turned to was reducing the value of its currency. The silver content of the coin known as the denarius was gradually reduced over time. On the surface, the coin looked exactly the same. But in reality, it was worth much less. As a result, prices began to rise. People gradually lost confidence in the currency. And the economic problems continued to grow. Not everyone experienced this in the same way. While wealthy people protected their wealth through land and other assets, ordinary citizens felt the impact of inflation and rising taxes much more severely. Rome's problems weren't only military. Its economic problems were just as significant. Now let's look at today. Governments taking on more debt. Growing budget deficits. Wars financed through borrowing. Central banks increasing the money supply to support the economy. Of course, today's world isn't exactly the same as Rome. History never repeats itself perfectly. But it's possible to see some very familiar patterns. Rome's story raises an important question. If an economic system depends on constant expansion, what happens when expansion comes to an end? What happens when new income stops coming in? How are the debts paid? How are the expenses covered? Throughout history, this has been one of the greatest challenges for governments. Rome's solution was higher taxes, greater state control, and changes to its monetary system. The methods used today are certainly different. But debates about government debt, public spending, and monetary policy continue to this day. That's why history isn't only important for understanding the past. It's also essential for understanding the present. Because sometimes events that happened hundreds of years ago can help us see today's challenges from a completely different perspective. Maybe the real questions are these. How do economic systems actually work? Who benefits from them? And in the end, who pays the price when crises occur? Once you begin looking for the answers to those questions, you start seeing not only Rome differently, but also the world you live in. Because history doesn't just tell us what happened in the past. It can also be one of the most powerful guides to understanding the present.